Welcome. Weary traveler, exhausted after a long day of playing too many roles. Have you ever lain down yet found your mind still rewinding? Every word you spoke, quietly, fearing that you failed to perform your role well enough in the eyes of others. That exhaustion does not come only from the body. It is the consequence of the ego busily carrying stones that were never meant to be yours. The persona masks we mistakenly believe to be our true selves. Carl Jung once reminded us that the social mask helps us survive. But when we cling to it too tightly, it becomes a prison of expectations. Hello, I am Milo, the one who will accompany you tonight on a journey into the mysterious, deeper layers of the psyche. This video is not merely a guide into sleep. It is a sanctuary of stillness, inviting you to descend into the unconscious and recognize how you present yourself to the world without even realizing it. Together, we will clean the glass of the lighthouse of awareness so that you may recognize your original face, the authentic being that has always been whole and silent beneath every title and every judgment. Do not remain a weary captain, struggling to control an ocean of thoughts. Take a deep breath, set down the raft of the persona, and allow this journey to carry you home into absolute rest. It is time to gaze upon the moon of inner peace, rather than endlessly polishing the finger that points toward it. Stay here. You are enough, and you have always been enough. 1. Persona, the stage play of life. In Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, the persona is not a distant or abstract concept. It is so close that we live with it every day, when we step out of the house, when we speak with colleagues, when we post a status update, or even when we choose to remain silent at the right moment. Jung called it the social mask, the image we present to the world in order to be accepted, in order to survive safely within the shared social order. The word persona originates from the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. On stage, the mask allowed the audience to recognize the role king or servant, hero or villain. But the essential point is this: the mask was never the true person of the actor. It was merely a device that made the role intelligible. Jung used this very image to describe how modern human beings appear before society we perform in order to be seen in a particular way. Jung wrote with striking directness, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is." Carl Jung Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. This sentence cuts straight into a painful paradox. The persona does not merely deceive others, it also deceives ourselves. When a person fully identifies with the role they perform, they no longer know where their true self ends, and where the constructed image, shaped to meet collective expectations, begins. At first glance, the persona is necessary. Without it, living among others would be nearly impossible. Society requires conventions, roles, and faces in order to function. Jung never denied this. He regarded the persona as an adaptive tool, a kind of agreement between the individual and the community. The problem begins when this tool seizes control. Many people do not realize that they have lived too long inside their role. The one who must always be strong. The one who must always be kind. The one who is never allowed to fail. The one who is never allowed to be weak. These roles may initially help a person survive, but over time, they turn into invisible prisons. Jung warned, the danger is that the ego may identify itself with the persona. Collected Works, Volume 7. When the ego identifies with the persona, a person begins to live as though they are the role itself. They no longer permit themselves emotions that are inappropriate thoughts that do not fit the image or desires that fall outside the role. And it is precisely here that deep exhaustion begins to emerge, not because life is too heavy, but because one must constantly strain to hold the performance together. There is another subtle paradox. The persona is often constructed from what society rewards. If you are loved for being obedient, your persona becomes the obedient one. If you are respected for being rational, your persona becomes the one without emotion. If you are recognized for success, your persona becomes the one who never stops. And gradually, other living parts of you, fear, confusion, vulnerability, dreaminess, are pushed into the darkness. Jung called what is pushed down the shadow. But what must be understood is this: the shadow does not arise randomly. It is created by the persona itself. Whatever is not permitted to appear on stage is driven backstage. Another statement by Jung is often quoted in shortened form, but its original wording carries greater weight. When an individual identifies too much with his persona, he becomes unconscious of his real individuality. Collected Works, Volume 10. Here, unconscious does not mean unknowing in the ordinary sense. It means losing living contact with oneself. A person may be successful, admired, trusted, yet inwardly carry a vague feeling that I am living someone else's life. The persona is like a stage play that runs for many years. At first, we know we are acting, but the longer we perform, the more we forget when the play began. Eventually, we call the role me. What Jung invites us to do is not to discard the persona, that would be both impossible and dangerous. He invites us to become conscious of it, to recognize this is the role I am playing. It is not the totality of who I am. Only then does the persona return to its rightful place, a mask that can be worn and can also be removed. This awakening is rarely loud. It arrives in deeply human moments when you are tired, but do not allow yourself to rest, when you are sad, but do not dare to speak, when you succeed, yet feel no joy. In those moments, the psyche whispers, "This role is taking up too much space." Jung believed that identity, crises, midlife crises, or feelings of existential emptiness are not failures, but signals. They indicate that the persona has gone too far and that the true person is demanding to be heard. Seen in this light, the persona is no longer an enemy. It is the first gateway of psychological maturation. Only when you realize that you are standing on a stage can you step down, not to disappear, but to live more fully. And perhaps the most important question is not, how am I presenting myself to the world? But rather, if I no longer needed to perform, who would I be? That is precisely the starting point of the journey. Jung called individuation becoming a real human being, rather than merely a role that receives applause. When we understand that the persona is not the true person, but a necessary role on the social stage, a deeper question naturally arises. Why do we need to perform at all in the first place? If the mask can cause us to lose ourselves, why does the human psyche persist in creating it, passing it down from generation to generation, as if it were an unavoidable instinct? Carl Jung's answer does not lie in morality, nor in falseness. It lies in the instinct for survival. 2. The survival instinct. Why do we need to perform? In the view of Carl Gustav Jung, the persona is not a mistake of the human psyche. On the contrary, it is an intelligent, adaptive mechanism formed to protect the individual from the immense pressure of the collective. Human beings are not born as independent entities. We are born fragile, dependent, and entirely in need of acceptance from others in order to survive. A child before it can think already knows how to observe. It learns to smile when praised, to remain silent, when reproached, to please in order to be loved. These reactions do not arise from deceit. They arise from the fear of exclusion. At the most primitive level, to be excluded from the group is equivalent to death. And it is precisely in this context that the persona comes into being. Jung regarded the persona as a psychological skin that allows the individual to come into contact with the world without being directly wounded. He wrote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Collected works. Valor 7. In other words, the persona is the point of contact between the inner ego and the external order. Without it, the individual would be exposed, unprotected, to the judgments, evaluations, and expectations that society constantly imposes. Not everyone has the strength to live without such a layer of protection. Thus, performing does not begin as a betrayal of the self. It begins as a survival strategy. We learn to become more acceptable, more normal, more appropriate, not in order to deceive, but in order to remain within the human circle. Jung emphasized that the persona is closely bound to the process of maturation. As one enters social life, schoolwork, marriage status, one is compelled to learn the language of roles. You cannot say everything you think. You cannot act on every impulse you feel. And without the persona, society would become a lawless battlefield. In this sense, the persona is a psychological achievement, not an error. It allows the individual to participate in collective life without being crushed by it. Jung frankly acknowledged, one cannot live without a persona, but one can live too much with it. The problem does not lie in the fact that we need to perform it, lies in the fact that we forget that we are performing. The survival instinct does not only drive us to adapt, it also drives us to be recognized. Society consistently rewards those who fit the model, the successful person, the strong person, the kind person, the one who causes no trouble. The persona is therefore gradually refined to maximize reward and minimize risk. We do not perform merely to survive. We perform to be loved, respected, and seen. And here, a subtle substitution takes place. When external recognition becomes the source that sustains the ego, the persona is no longer merely a tool. It becomes a condition of psychological existence. Jung warned of this when he wrote, "When the persona is rigid, the individual becomes alienated from his own instincts." Collected works. Volume 8. Instincts which form the foundation of life itself are pushed aside to make room for image. A person begins to live according to how one should be, rather than how one is. Yet the paradox is this: the very survival instinct that created the persona is later suffocated by the persona itself. A person may live very correctly, very well, very praised, and yet inwardly carry a dangerous feeling that if they stop performing, they will no longer have value. This is the deepest fear the persona conceals, the fear of not being loved, if I am truly myself. Jung saw this tragedy clearly. He believed that much anxiety, depression, and existential emptiness do not arise because life is too harsh, but because the individual is forced to maintain an image that is no longer compatible with inner life. When the survival instinct continues to pressure us to hold the role while the soul has grown weary, a fracture begins to appear. What must be emphasized is this: Jung did not call for the abandonment of society or the destruction of all roles. He understood that human beings are social creatures and that the persona is indispensable. But he also insisted that the persona should be a facade, not a foundation. The persona is not the individual's true character, but only a mask. Collected Works, Volume 7. When we remember this, the survival instinct no longer governs us blindly. It returns to its proper place, a force that helps us survive, not a force that defines who we are. Psychological maturity, according to Jung, is not the end of performing. It is learning to perform consciously, knowing when the mask is needed and when it can be set aside. Knowing that adaptation does not require self-betrayal. And it is precisely at this point that another door begins to open, where the question is no longer, how do I fit in? But how can I live within society without losing my soul? That is where the deeper journey begins. The place where Jung leads us from the persona into the deeper layers of the human psyche. Once we understand that the persona does not arise from falseness, but from the instinct for survival, we begin to recognize something even deeper. The mask is not formed in adulthood. It is shaped very early in life, during the first years, when love, acceptance, and safety are still matters of survival. To understand why human beings grow up with the need to play the right role, we must return to the place where the persona is first learned: childhood. 3. Origins in childhood. The lesson of compliance. In the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, childhood is not merely a phase of biological development. It is the unconscious foundation of all later psychological life. Before a child has language to express itself, it already possesses an extremely subtle capacity: the ability to sense what is loved and what is not. A child does not need to be verbally taught to comply. It learns this through the reactions of its environment. When it behaves well, it is praised. When it cries, it is scolded. When it obeys, it is embraced. When it expresses anger, it is ignored or punished. Gradually, within that immature psyche, an equation is formed: being oneself, being loved. This is not a tragedy intentionally caused by parents. Jung viewed it as a universal law of social life. The family, like society, requires order, and that order is communicated through reward and punishment. But for the child's psyche, this leaves a profound imprint: conditional love. Jung once wrote a sentence that is simple yet weighty: the child's first environment is the psyche of the parents. Collected Works, Volume 17. This means that a child does not live only in a physical house, but also within the psychological climate of those who care for it. If that environment accepts only certain expressions, the child will learn to selectively shape itself in order to survive. Primitive impulses, anger, jealousy, fear, desire, curiosity do not disappear, but they become forbidden. And when a part of the self is experienced as unlovable, the child's psyche does the only thing it can do: it represses. At this stage, the persona is no longer a social mask. It becomes an emotional survival strategy. The child learns to become the good child, the obedient child, the child who does not cause trouble. And each time it succeeds, it is rewarded with attention, safety, or at least peace. Jung described this process as the sacrifice of instinct in exchange for adaptation. He warned that the cost of adapting too early is inner fragmentation. He wrote, "The more a man's life is shaped by collective norms, the greater is his individual immorality." Collected Works, Volume 10. Here, immorality does not carry its conventional ethical meaning. It refers to the individual's betrayal of inner truth. When natural parts of the self are repressed in order to conform, they do not vanish, they descend into the unconscious. From this point, an idealized protective shell is constructed, not to deceive, but to be loved without being wounded. The child learns to read adults' eyes, to anticipate reactions, and to adjust behavior accordingly. This is the first school of the persona. The danger is that this lesson is never graduated from. As adults, human beings continue to carry these old strategies into the grown-up world. We still seek acceptance by hiding what is inappropriate. We still fear that if we reveal our true emotions, we will be abandoned, even though the threat is no longer real. Jung recognized that many adults live like children, trying to be good before an imagined world. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The reflexes of compliance, learned in childhood, silence, endurance, pleasing, continue to govern adult life like an invisible destiny. We call this personality nature, or "that's just how I am," without realizing that these are outdated adaptations that were never revised. Here, a subtle distinction must be made. Jung did not blame parents, nor did he regard compliance as wrong. He understood that without compliance, a child could not survive in society. But he also emphasized that maturity requires revisiting those unconscious agreements. When a person is never allowed to feel anger, anger becomes shadow. When a person is never allowed to be weak, vulnerability is buried, and those buried parts What Jung called the shadow will seek a way back, often in distorted forms: anxiety, depression, self-sabotage, or painfully repetitive relationships. Thus, the childhood lesson of compliance is both the foundation of the persona and the seed of inner conflict. It helps us be loved, but at the cost of learning not to love ourselves fully. The Jungian journey does not begin with rebellion against the past. It begins with compassionate understanding: I once needed to be this way in order to survive. And from that understanding, a new question arises, deep and unavoidable. If I am no longer the child who must comply in order to be loved, do I still need that mask today? This question does not destroy who you are. It opens the path for who you truly are to begin to speak. When the lessons of compliance learned in childhood are repeated for long enough, the persona ceases to be merely a temporary strategy. It becomes an identity that is recognized, rewarded, and reinforced over time. And it is precisely here that a quiet danger emerges. The actor begins to believe that he is the role. What once served as a protective shell gradually takes over the center of psychological life, and the ego slips into the trap of identification. 4. The trap of identification. When the actor forgets who he is. In Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, the greatest danger of the persona does not lie in the fact that we wear a mask, but in the fact that we forget we are wearing one. When the ego completely identifies with the mask, the person no longer uses the role, they become the role. Jung referred to this as the inflation of the persona, a condition in which the social image swells until it obscures inner life. He issued a clear warning. The danger is that the ego may identify itself with the persona. Collected Works, Vol. 7. At first glance, this identification may appear harmless, even socially admired. A person is the director, is the successful one, is the strong one, is the impeccably proper individual. But beneath the surface, a dangerous shift has taken place. Self-worth becomes bound to the role. When the role stands firm, the person feels they exist. When the role falters, they collapse. The ego, which is meant to be the center of consciousness and the guide of personal life, becomes dependent on external recognition once it identifies with the persona. It no longer asks, "Who am I?" but only, "How am I being seen?" Jung described this state with chilling clarity. When an individual identifies with his persona, he becomes unconscious of his real individuality. Collected Works, Vol. 10. Here, unconscious does not mean simple ignorance. It means the loss of living contact with the true self. Such a person may function efficiently, speak fluently, and maintain a flawless image. But when the door closes, when the stage curtain falls, they are confronted with a nameless emptiness. It is this emptiness that gives rise to the sense of shallowness Jung spoke of, not because the person lacks ability, but because inner life has been starved for too long. The persona has no depth of its own. It merely reflects collective expectations. When the ego lives entirely within it, the individual gradually becomes rigid, defensive, and fearful of any change that might crack the image they depend upon. Jung once observed, "A man who is identified with his persona is deprived of his individuality." Collected Works, Volume 8. This loss is not dramatic. It does not occur in a single tragic moment. It unfolds slowly and logically. Each time an inappropriate emotion is dismissed, each time an inner question is suppressed because it does not fit the role, each time image is chosen over honesty with oneself. Bit by bit, the actor forgets that there was once a life beyond the stage. The irony is that society often rewards this identification. The person who identifies with a title is seen as professional. The person who identifies with an image is seen as stable. But Jung perceived the hidden cost of these rewards. When life changes, job loss, retirement crisis, aging, the persona loses its stage and the ego has nothing left to cling to. According to Jung, many midlife crises are not crises of time, but crises of identity. When the old role no longer fits the individual, is forced to confront the question they have avoided all their life. If I am no longer this role, then who am I? Jung described this moment as a necessary collapse. He wrote, "The breakdown of the persona is often the first step toward individuation. The emptiness that appears when the curtain falls is not failure. It is a signal. It announces that the ego has lived too long inside an image and must return to dialogue with the neglected inner life." What is crucial to understand is this: Jung did not regard the persona as an enemy. The trap does not lie in the mask itself, but in blind identification with it. When the persona is held consciously, it is a tool. When it is unconscious, it becomes a psychological prison. Therefore, the Jungian path does not demand that we abandon social roles. It asks that we maintain an inner distance from them, to know that a title is not the soul, to know that a role is not an identity, and to know that behind every image there is still a living human being waiting to be heard. When the actor remembers that he is more than the role, a subtle shift begins. The ego loosens its grip on the stage, and for the first time in a long while, the individual dares to step into their own backstage. There is no applause, but there is the beginning of being oneself. When the ego identifies with the mask and lives entirely on the social stage, an inevitable consequence unfolds in the psychological backstage. Everything that does not fit the role is pushed out of the spotlight. Emotions that contradict the image, impulses that are not permitted, parts that are deemed not who I should be, do not disappear. They retreat into darkness. And it is precisely here that another figure steps forward: the shadow. 5. The shadow, the rejected brother. In the system of Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, the shadow is not pure evil, nor is it a moral concept. It is simply the sum total of those parts of the human being that consciousness refuses to acknowledge as its own. If the persona is the image we present to the light, then the shadow is what is left behind, unseen, unnamed, yet never ceased to exist. Jung defined the shadow in a brief but weighty statement. The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2. What is crucial to understand is this: the shadow is not created deliberately. It is formed passively as a direct consequence of self-selection. Each time we say, "I am not that kind of person," some part of us is pushed into the darkness. And the more that is excluded in order to preserve the image, the denser the shadow becomes. There is a profoundly Jungian paradox here. The better the persona, the worse the shadow, at least, in how it is experienced. The person who must always be kind will carry a shadow full of anger. The one who must always be rational will carry a shadow filled with chaotic emotion. The one who must always be strong will carry a shadow that is fearful and vulnerable, not because they are bad, but because these parts are not permitted to appear on the stage. Jung warned of this with a well-known observation. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Collected Works, Volume 11. The shadow is not an enemy. It is the rejected brother. It carries the same life energy as the persona, but it is confined within the darkness of the unconscious. And because it is repressed, the shadow does not express itself in healthy ways. It emerges indirectly in distorted forms and often beyond conscious control. This is why many people are startled by their own behavior. Sudden outbursts of anger without clear cause, disproportionate reactions, self-sabotaging actions, or relationships that repeat the same pain. Jung did not view these as moral weaknesses. He saw them as the shadow seeking a path into the light. One of the clearest ways the shadow reveals itself is through projection. Jung wrote, Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. What we do not accept within ourselves is seen in others and despised there. We condemn others' selfishness because we do not permit ourselves to be selfish. We scorn others' weakness because we are not allowed to be weak. In this way, the shadow continues to live not within us, but in the images we hold of other people. But the shadow does not contain only what is bad. This is a common misunderstanding. Jung emphasized that the shadow also holds suppressed vital potentials, creativity, softness, instinct, joy, even the capacity for deep love. Anything that does not fit the persona can fall into the shadow, including what is good. The shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. It may be a source of strength. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. The problem is this: when the shadow is completely denied, it ceases to be a resource. It becomes a destructive force. When it is not lived consciously, it lives through symptoms. When it is not listened to, it screams. When it is not acknowledged, it controls from behind the scenes. Here, Jung offers a perspective very different from traditional morality. He does not say that the shadow must be eliminated. He says that it must be recognized and entered into dialogue with. The shadow does not need to be released without limits. It needs to be integrated. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Making the darkness conscious is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of maturity. It requires the courage to look at the parts we have rejected and the compassion to understand why they were once pushed away. The shadow was not born to destroy us. It was born because at some point we needed to survive. In the context of the persona, the shadow is the price paid for excessive adaptation. The more radiant the mask, the longer the shadow behind it. And at some point, that shadow can no longer be ignored. It appears in dreams, in relationships, in crises, in the feeling that I no longer recognize myself. Jung regarded the confrontation with the shadow as a psychological threshold. No one crosses it without fear, but no one matures by turning away. The shadow does not ask us to abandon the persona. It asks us not to sacrifice our entire humanity to a false light. When we dare to admit that we are both kind and angry, both strong and vulnerable, both noble and selfish, we do not become worse. We become more whole. And it is precisely from this encounter with the rejected brother that an even deeper journey begins, a journey no longer about performing or not performing, but about living with the whole of who we are in both light and darkness. When the shadow is denied for too long, it cannot remain dormant in the unconscious. The repressed parts carry powerful life energy, and that energy always seeks expression. But because the ego lacks the courage to look directly at itself, the shadow chooses another path. It steps into the outer world, and it is here that a subtle mechanism appears: projection. 6. Projection. Seeing oneself through others. In Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, projection is not a moral failing, but a natural psychological mechanism. When an unconscious content is too powerful to be acknowledged, it does not disappear. Instead, it is thrown outward, assigned to other people, other situations, or the surrounding world. Jung described this phenomenon in a well-known statement: projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Collected Works, Volume 10. The world we perceive is no longer the world as it is. It becomes a mirror reflecting those parts of ourselves that we are not yet conscious enough to recognize as our own. And because we fail to see this, we become convinced that the problem lies in others, not in ourselves. Projection often begins very quietly. We are strongly triggered by someone. We judge them harshly in a way disproportionate to the situation. We feel irritation, anger, contempt, or even hatred, without understanding why. Jung believed that such excessive emotional reactions rarely speak about the external object. They speak about something that has been touched within. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This sentence is not meant as a comforting platitude. It is an invitation to confrontation. What we cannot tolerate in others: weakness, selfishness, falseness, ambition. The need for attention is often precisely what is not allowed to live within ourselves. The unacknowledged shadow lives on through the images of others. The paradox is this projection allows the ego to preserve a clean self-image. I am not angry. The other person is despicable. I am not selfish. They are greedy. I am not weak. They are the pathetic one. In this way, the shadow continues to exist, but in the form of a moral battle with the world. Jung clearly recognized the cost of this mechanism. When people live in projection, they lose the ability to see the world objectively, and more importantly, they lose the opportunity to understand themselves. He wrote, "As long as the shadow is projected, it remains unconscious." Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2. As long as the shadow is seen out there, it can never be integrated in here. And this turns relational life into a series of recurring conflicts. We change environments, change relationships, change targets, yet the same emotions return as if the world itself were always the problem. Projection does not occur only in conflict. It also appears in idealization. We admire someone blindly attributing to them almost superhuman qualities. Jung regarded this, too, as a form of projection, one in which our own vital potentials are cast outward and assigned to another person. We love them not only for who they are, but because they are carrying on our behalf parts of ourselves we have not yet dared to live. At both extremes, hatred and idealization, the mechanism is the same. We are not fully present within ourselves. One of the greatest tragedies of projection is that it convinces people that the problems of their lives always lie in others. My family does not understand me. Society is wrong. That person is toxic. While these statements may sometimes be true, Jung insisted that intense emotional reactions are always worth examining, not for self-blame, but for self-understanding. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. When the shadow is acknowledged, projection begins to withdraw, not because the world becomes perfect, but because we no longer need the world to conceal ourselves. We can see others' flaws without needing to destroy them. We can admire someone without losing ourselves. Jung regarded the withdrawal of projections as a major turning point in psychological maturation. It requires courage because it means saying, "What I am seeing in you also lives in me," not in terms of behavior, but in terms of human potential. This does not make us worse. It makes us more real. As projections are gradually withdrawn, the world loses some of its drama, but inner life becomes richer. We no longer need to battle imaginary enemies outside. Instead, we begin a more difficult but more truthful dialogue, a dialogue with ourselves. And it is precisely here that a profound shift occurs. We no longer need judgment in order to survive. We no longer need idealization in order to feel complete. We begin to see human beings, both ourselves and others, as complex entities containing both light and darkness. Projection, once recognized, is no longer a trap. It becomes a path that leads from a world full of enemies and idols back to a quieter place where we begin to take responsibility for our own inner life. And this is the moment Jung described as the beginning of mature consciousness. As projections are gradually withdrawn, the world contains fewer enemies and fewer idols, but another feeling rises more clearly to the surface: exhaustion. Not exhaustion caused by work or circumstances, but exhaustion from having to maintain an image, from constantly monitoring every inner movement so as not to crack a carefully constructed mask. It is precisely at this point that the cost of perfection begins to reveal itself. 7. Walking in shoes that are too tight. The cost of perfection. In Carl Gustav Jung's view, the psychological exhaustion of modern human beings does not arise from a lack of ability or discipline. It comes from a more subtle cause, living for too long within structures that no longer fit inner life. Jung repeatedly observed that when people strive to maintain a perfect image, they resemble someone who walks every day in shoes that are too tight, leaving no room for the natural movement of life, yet forcing themselves to keep going. The image of shoes that are too tight is not meant to condemn striving. Jung did not oppose effort or standards. What he warned against was identification with standards when the ego believes it has value only insofar as it perfectly fits what is expected. In such a state, every slight emotional deviation, sadness, anger, fatigue, doubt, is regarded as something that should not exist. The problem is, this psychological life does not operate through perfection. It operates through life energy, what Jung called libido. Libido is not merely sexual energy. It is the living current of emotion, instinct, creativity, and meaning. Jung stated clearly, libido is energy taken in the widest sense of the word. Collected Works, Volume 5. When the persona becomes too perfect, this flow of energy is constricted. A great deal of energy is consumed simply to hold the role, controlling expressions, editing emotions, avoiding inner conflict. Outwardly, everything may appear stable, but inwardly, there is a constant muscular tension. Exhaustion arises not because one does too much, but because one lives against one's natural rhythm. Jung recognized that the ideal of perfection is often nourished by fear. Fear of judgment, fear of exclusion, fear of not being enough. And that fear drives people to sacrifice vitality rather than risk losing the image. He warned of this danger when speaking of the persona. The persona is a compromise between individual and society. Collected Works, Volume 7. A healthy compromise allows flexibility, but when compromise becomes identity, flexibility disappears. People become rigid with themselves, allowing no deviation, no rest, no vulnerability. The tighter the shoes, the more painful each step, yet stopping seems even more frightening. Perfection also creates a dangerous illusion that if the image is maintained well enough, suffering can be avoided. Jung regarded this as a misunderstanding. Suffering does not disappear when it is concealed. It changes form. It becomes chronic exhaustion, nameless anxiety, existential emptiness. These symptoms are not enemies. They are signals that the soul lacks space to breathe. Jung emphasized a fundamental principle of psychological maturation. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Collected Works, Vol. 12. This statement does not glorify asceticism. It reminds us that consciousness requires honesty, and honesty can be painful because it demands the admission that the mask we are holding has grown too tight. Perfection, when maintained through denial, always exacts the price of vitality. Another paradox of perfection is that it separates people from their source of creativity. Creativity requires experimentation, error, play. But the perfect persona fears mistakes, fears missteps, fears being seen as not enough. Jung believed that when the instinct for play is suppressed, life energy turns away from consciousness and sinks into the unconscious, where it exerts pressure in reverse. What we do not face in ourselves will meet us as fate. Collected Works, Vol. 11. Exhaustion from an enforced role is not random fate. It is the consequence of avoiding confrontation with human limitation. No one can live indefinitely within an idealized image without paying a price, and that price is often the loss of connection with the body, with emotion, and with meaning. Jung did not propose a life of indulgence. He proposed fit, a persona good enough to live in society, yet wide enough for the soul to move, standards high enough to foster growth, yet human enough to allow fatigue, doubt, and error. Then the shoes cease to be instruments of torture and become means of support. The moment a person allows themselves to remove the shoes that are too tight, even if only in private, is the moment life energy begins to return, not as an explosion, but as relief. Breathing deepens, the body softens, the mind stops standing guard. These are signs that the persona is being restored to its proper place. Jung believed that maturity does not lie in becoming more perfect, but in becoming more whole. Wholeness includes both light and fatigue, both capacity and limitation. When people dare to live with this sense of fit, they no longer need to prove who they are. They begin to be who they are. And from this very lightness, a deeper question begins to arise. If I do not need to be perfect in order to deserve life, what within me is waiting to be truly lived? When the price of perfection has been paid in exhaustion and emptiness, many people do not remove the mask, they tighten it further. And among the masks most highly praised by society, there is one that is especially dangerous, precisely because it looks so right. The mask of the good person. 8. The tragedy of the good man and the mask of virtue. In Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, virtue itself is not the problem. The tragedy arises when virtue is turned into a compulsory identity, when a person comes to believe that they must be good in order to deserve existence. At that point, the persona is no longer merely a social mask. It becomes an internal moral standard that monitors and punishes every impulse deemed inappropriate. The good man, or more broadly, the good person, is often admired, kind, accommodating, non-confrontational, always doing the right thing. But Jung perceived the shadow side of this image. When the ego identifies with virtue, half of the person is pushed into darkness. Assertiveness, healthy anger, desire, boundaries, all are labeled and denied. Jung spoke bluntly about the danger of one-sided virtue. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow. Collected Works, Volume 11. The more radiant the moral persona, the heavier the shadow becomes. The good person does not permit themselves to feel anger, so anger turns passive-aggressive. They do not permit selfishness, so needs leak out through bargaining and resentment. They do not permit assertiveness, so power emerges in distorted forms through covert control or self-sabotage. This is not a lack of morality. It is morality without shadow, and therefore without depth. Jung drew a clear distinction between lived morality and persona morality. Lived morality arises from dialogue with the whole person, including the difficult parts. Persona morality arises from fear. Fear of judgment, fear of abandonment, fear of not being loved. And out of fear, the good person learns to sacrifice authenticity in order to preserve the image. He warned a man who is identified with his persona is deprived of his individuality. Collected Works, Volume 8. The lack of depth in relationships does not come from poor communication skills, but from the absence of the whole person. When someone is always right, the relationship becomes safe, but flat. There is no friction, no vitality, no difficult truth. The other person senses, without necessarily being able to name it, that they are relating to an image, not to a human being. A bitter paradox is that the good person often ends up in unfair relationships. Because they do not permit themselves to be assertive, they surrender boundaries. Because they fear hurting others, they swallow their needs. And the shadow, where the repressed energy resides, will seek to restore balance, often through delayed outbursts, sudden decisions, or cold withdrawal. Those around them are left confused. I thought he was a good man. Jung explained this phenomenon through the compensatory principle of the psyche. The psyche is a self-regulating system. Collected works. Vala 8. What is suppressed will seek its return. Virtue that is not accompanied by inner strength produces a fragile morality, one that shatters under pressure. By contrast, virtue built upon the integration of the shadow has resilience. It knows how to say no. It knows how to be angry without destroying. It knows how to protect boundaries without annihilating love. A common misunderstanding is the belief that integrating the shadow will make a person worse. Jung rejected this. He emphasized that only by acknowledging darkness does genuine morality become possible. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The good person does not need to become bad in order to mature. They need to become real. A real person has kindness and strength, compassion and boundaries, accommodation and decisiveness. When instinctual energy is brought into the light, it does not destroy morality. It gives morality a backbone. In intimate relationships, this authenticity is essential. Love does not need someone who is always right. It needs someone who is present. Jung understood that intimacy involves risk. The risk of being seen, misunderstood, rejected, but avoiding that risk by hiding behind the mask of virtue only trades depth for empty safety. The tragedy of the good man is not that he is good. The tragedy is that he cuts away half of himself in order to be loved. And love obtained through such self-amputation cannot nourish the soul for long. The Jungian path opens another way, the morality of wholeness. Here the ego is not a moral police officer guarding the shadow, but a coordinator who knows how to listen. Here, instinctual strength is trained, not buried. And here, the good person is no longer a role. They become a human being with depth. When the mask of virtue is set down, what appears is not chaos, but life. A life strong enough to speak truth, soft enough to love, and courageous enough to stand firmly within itself. And only then does morality cease to be an obligation. It becomes the natural expression of a whole human being. When the mask of virtue is held too tightly, when the good person becomes the only role permitted to exist, the psyche does not remain silently compliant. The repressed parts do not seek return only through the shadow or through projection. They find another space, one where the persona holds no authority. This is the moment when dreams begin to speak. 9. the compensatory voice of dreams. In Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, dreams are not random chaos produced by the brain, nor are they meaningless fantasies. Jung regarded dreams as a self-regulating function of the psyche, a compensatory voice that emerges when conscious life has fallen out of balance. He wrote unequivocally, "Dreams are the natural reaction of the self-regulating psychic system." Collected Works, Volume 8. When daytime life is lived too heavily on the side of the persona, too moral, too proper, too controlled, the unconscious responds with opposing images. Dreams do not come to comfort the ego. They come to speak the truth that waking consciousness does not wish to hear. Jung once compared dreams to letters written in the language of symbols, not the language of logic, but the language of images, emotions, and paradox. And like difficult letters, dreams do not state things directly, they indicate. The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. Collected Works, Volume 10. When the persona devours other parts of the personality, dreams bring them back onto the nocturnal stage. A person who is always kind by day may dream of committing cruelty. One who is controlled by day may dream of losing control. One who is moral by day may dream of forbidden desires. Not because they are but because the psyche is seeking to restore balance. What must be understood is this: dreams do not judge. They do not say, "You are wrong." They say, "You are lacking space for some aspect of life, lacking acknowledgement for an energy that is being suffocated." And so the dream brings that element forth, often in forms that are disturbing. Jung emphasized that dream contents are typically compensatory to the conscious attitude. The dream shows the inner truth and reality of the patient as it really is. Collected Works, Volume 16. Inner truth is not the polished image the persona wishes to present. It is the psychological reality that is actually operating. When we play the good person, by daydreams may expose the anger that has been denied. When we are overly rational, by daydreams may overflow with emotion and instinct. This is not sabotage. It is a reminder. Dreams become especially important during periods of exhaustion caused by enforced roles. When life energy libido no longer flows through consciousness, it retreats into the unconscious, and dreams become vivid, intense, even haunting. Jung viewed this as a warning signal. Daytime life has become psychologically impoverished. The unconscious compensates the conscious attitude. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. If consciousness insists on living as a straight line, the unconscious will draw a curve. If daytime allows only light, nighttime will bring darkness, not to punish, but to rescue wholeness. A common mistake is to treat dreams as things to be decoded quickly. Jung did not approach dreams as intellectual puzzles. He approached them as dialogues. Every image in a dream is a speaking part of the psyche. And the essential question is not, what does it mean? But rather, what is it trying to compensate for in my life? When a person is overly identified with the mask of virtue, dreams often become immoral in the conventional sense. But Jung stressed that the morality of dreams does not coincide with social morality. It is the morality of life itself, where what is forbidden by day is permitted by night, so that the individual is not destroyed from within. The dream is specifically the utterance of the unconscious. Collected Works, Volume 8. If this utterance is not listened to, the unconscious will speak louder through symptoms, crises, depression, or a loss of meaning. Dreams are the gentlest path the psyche chooses to correct its course. In the Jungian journey, learning to listen to dreams is not about becoming mystical. It is about becoming real. Real with contradiction, real with darkness, real with what has been neglected. When dreams are respected, the persona does not need to collapse. Suddenly, it can be adjusted gradually. Jung believed that a psychologically mature person is one who treats dreams as allies, not enemies. This ally does not flatter the ego, but it does not destroy it either. It reminds us, you are not only the role you play by day, you are a living totality. And that totality must be heard from both sides, conscious and unconscious. When we dare to live with less pretense, by daydreams scream less at night. When we allow more truth into waking life, the night brings more guidance. And within this dialogue, the human being begins to return to balance, not the balance of perfection, but the balance of wholeness. Ultimately, dreams do not come to expose falseness in order to shame us. They come to keep the soul from being swallowed by the social mask. And if we have the courage to read that letter, it will lead us closer to our true self, where life no longer needs to perform, and morality no longer needs to pretend. When dreams have begun to speak, when the unconscious has sent its symbolic letters to draw the human being away from the social mask, a deeper question starts to emerge. Who is the guide within that inner world? What enables the ego not only to see the darkness, but also to cross the boundary between consciousness and the unconscious, and touch the depth of the soul? For Carl Jung, the answer lies in two pivotal archetypes, Anima and Animus. 10. Anima and Animus. The bridge between two worlds. In Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, anima and animus are not concepts of biological sex, nor are they social stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. They are unconscious archetypes that represent opposing psychological qualities present in every human being. Anima is the feminine principle in the psyche of a man. Animus is the masculine principle in the psyche of a woman. And most importantly, they are the bridges that connect the ego to the inner world. Jung stated this clearly. Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman. Not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. Similarly, he affirmed the presence of the animus in women as an archetypal masculine image, representing reason, will, and directing strength. These images are not learned from outside. They are inherent in the structure of the collective unconscious. They are inner figures that dreams, imagination, and deep emotions repeatedly bring to the surface. The central role of anima and animus is guidance. When the ego is imprisoned within the persona, rigid, moralized, one-sided, it loses the capacity to approach the unconscious safely. The shadow is too overwhelming. Dreams are too ambiguous. Anima and animus appear as intermediaries, offering images, emotions, and meanings that the ego can receive. Jung described the anima in a well-known statement. The anima is a natural archetype that satisfactorily sums up all the statements of the unconscious of man. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. In other words, the anima is the voice of the soul for a man through which emotion, intuition, relatedness, and meaning are conveyed. When a man lives too long within a hard, rational, controlling persona, the anima often appears in dreams as a mysterious woman, guiding, provoking, or at times disrupting. Not to mislead him, but to draw him back toward inner life. Likewise, Jung viewed the animus as the principle of spirit and will within the psyche of a woman. He wrote, "The animus is the deposit, as it were, of all woman's ancestral experiences of man." Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2. The animus is not merely the inner man. It represents the capacity for reasoning direction and self-assertion. When a woman becomes identified with a pleasing, adaptive, accommodating persona, the animus may appear as an inner critical voice, hard, rigid, sometimes even cruel. If denied, the animus becomes authoritarian. If integrated, it becomes a backbone of inner strength. The crucial point is this: anima and animus are not meant to replace the ego, but to expand it. They draw the ego out of the prison of social roles by inviting a different kind of experience, the experience of relationship with depth. Jung emphasized that the relationship with Anima, or Animus, marks a turning point in psychological maturation. The encounter with the Anima is the masterpiece of individuation. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. It is a masterpiece, not because it is easy, but because it demands a particular courage. Anima and Animus often first appear through projection. We fall passionately in love, idealize intensely or fiercely hate someone of the opposite sex. Jung saw such infatuations as signs the archetype is seeking entry into consciousness. If projections are not withdrawn, we continue to search for a savior or an enemy outside ourselves. But when projections are reclaimed, Anima and Animus return to their rightful place as inner guides. External relationships become less enchanted, while the inner relationship grows more alive. The bridging role of Anima and Animus is most evident in dreams and in active imagination. They appear to guide the way through regions of the unconscious that the ego cannot traverse alone. Jung regarded this as the path by which one can escape the imprisonment of the persona without falling into chaos. The Anima and Animus are the bridge to the unconscious. Although this sentence is often paraphrased, Jung's meaning is clear. Without a bridge, confronting the unconscious would be too dangerous. Anima and Animus soften the boundary, provide dialogical images, and teach the ego to listen rather than to control. When Anima or Animus is integrated, a subtle transformation occurs. A man becomes deeper without becoming weak. A woman becomes more decisive without becoming rigid. Not because they become the other gender, but because they become more whole. Jung believed that the soul does not operate through rigid dualities. It operates through dialogue between opposites. Anima and Animus embody that dialogue between emotion and reason, relatedness, and direction, depth and form. When the ego learns to cross this bridge, the persona is no longer a prison. It becomes a flexible facade of a house with depth. The individual no longer needs to perform in order to live, nor to destroy society in order to find themselves. They stand in between where two worlds meet. And at that point of convergence, Jung names a new state, a life with meaning. Not meaning bestowed by society, but meaning that arises when a person reconnects with their own soul through the quiet inner guides called Anima and Animus. When Anima and Animus have fulfilled their role as bridges. When the ego has learned to enter depth without panic or projection, another impulse emerges, quiet, yet irresistible. The question is no longer, what role am I playing? But who am I becoming? It is precisely here that the central journey in Carl Gustav Jung's thought begins. Individuation. 11. Individuation, the journey of removing the costume. Within Jung's entire system of thought, individuation is not a technique nor a special spiritual state. It is the living trajectory of a mature human being, the gradual process of becoming the most authentic person one can be. Jung emphasized that individuation does not separate us from society. On the contrary, it enables us to stand within society without losing the soul. Jung defined individuation as follows. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, that is, a separate, indivisible unity, or whole. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2. Whole is the key word. Individuation is not about becoming morally better, nor socially more perfect. It is about wholeness, when persona, shadow, Anima/Animus, and the ego no longer engage in hidden conflict, but are placed into a conscious relationship with one another. This journey begins with a simple act that requires great courage, removing the costume, not abandoning social roles, but ceasing to identify with them. When a person realizes that they are not merely a title, an image, or a personal narrative, a new inner space opens where the parts once excluded begin to demand their right to exist. Jung warned that no one enters individuation without confronting the shadow. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Facing the shadow is not degeneration. It is radical honesty. It is the acknowledgement of anger, selfishness, fear, vulnerability, not to act blindly upon them, but to integrate their energy into conscious life. When integrated, the shadow becomes vitality boundaries, and depth no longer a saboteur. Individuation also requires the gradual withdrawal of projections. Instead of seeking enemies or saviors outside the individual, learns to take responsibility for inner life. Jung stated clearly, "Everything that is unconscious in ourselves we discover in our neighbor." Collected Works, Volume 10. As projections are reclaimed, the world becomes less dramatic, but the self becomes more real. This is a necessary loss, the loss of illusions that nourish the ego, in exchange for a firmer foundation. A common misunderstanding is the belief that individuation is a lonely, self-centered journey. Jung rejected this. He argued that only those who have not individuated live entirely by the collective. The individuated person, by contrast, is capable of genuine contribution because they are no longer living by imitation. Individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to oneself. Collected Works, Volume 8. This means that when a person lives in accordance with their psychological structure, they bring to the community something irreplaceable, living uniqueness, not through rebellion, but through grounded presence. Throughout this process, Anima and Animus continue to serve as guides. They help the ego dialogue with the unconscious without being overwhelmed. Jung called this encounter the centerpiece of individuation. The encounter with the Anima is the masterpiece of Individuation Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. Yet the ultimate destination of individuation is neither anima nor shadow. It is the self, the coordinating center of the entire psyche. Not the controlling ego, but a deeper order in which opposites are held in creative tension. Jung wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the circumference of the whole personality." Collected Works, Volume 12. When the self begins to be sensed, life no longer revolves around maintaining an image. The questions change no longer. How do I appear? But what is seeking to live through me? This is a fundamental shift from control to listening, from performance to presence. Individuation does not promise constant happiness. Jung was frank about this. He regarded it as a demanding path, at times lonely, yet meaningful. Meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. Collected Works, Volume 11. Meaning, here is not a flattering story about oneself, but the deep sense that one's life is being lived from within, rather than dragged along by external expectations. The journey of removing the costume does not end with a fixed, true version of the self. It is a lifelong process, each stage requiring the removal of another mask. Yet with each removal, the individual becomes less fearful, less compelled to perform, and closer to themselves. For Jung, individuation is not the privilege of a few special people. It is the task of a human life not to become different from others, but to cease living as a copy. And when a person has the courage to walk this path, they do not become heroes or saints. They become something simpler, yet far more difficult. A real human being, one in whom light and darkness no longer exclude one another, but together form a living whole with depth and with meaning. When the journey of individuation has helped us remove the costume, integrate the shadow, withdraw projections, and learn to cross the Anima Animus bridge, a deeper order gradually reveals itself. It is no longer an effort to become someone, but a return to a center that has always been present, yet long obscured by roles. Jung called this center the self. 12. Returning to the self. True wholeness. In the thought of Carl Gustav Jung, the self is neither an inflated ego nor an idealized moral image. The self is the living totality of the personality, where consciousness and the unconscious no longer annihilate one another, but stand in a creative tension. Jung wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the circumference of the whole personality." Collected Works, Vol. 12. This statement contains a profound paradox. The self is both the coordinating center and the encompassing whole. When a person returns to the self, they do not contract. They expand to embrace the opposites that once divided them: strength and vulnerability, reason and emotion, discipline and instinct. Here, wholeness does not arise from eliminating contradiction, but from the capacity to carry contradiction without collapse. Returning to the self is not a fleeting moment of revelation. It is a sustained realignment. When the persona no longer dominates, energy is no longer consumed by maintaining an image. When the shadow is integrated, life is no longer disrupted by blind compensations. When Anima and Animus become inner guides, the ego learns how to listen. And it is precisely in this listening that the self begins to speak, not through commands, but through meaning. Jung emphasized that the self does not impose social morality. It orients through an inner sense of right and wrong, a telos, a purpose of psychic life. The goal of individuation is the realization of the self. Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 2. Realization here does not mean attaining a perfect state, but living in accordance with one's deep structure. When living in alignment, a person no longer needs to perform in order to be accepted. Acceptance emerges as a natural consequence of authenticity. Others sense it not through words, but through presence. One of the ancient symbols Jung used to express the self is the mandala, a circular form with a center where opposites are arranged around a unifying point. Mandalas arise spontaneously in dreams, drawings, and imaginations of those approaching wholeness. This is no coincidence. It is the image of order being re-established. Jung wrote, "The mandala is the psychological expression of the totality of the self." Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1. When the self is felt, the rhythm of life changes. There is no longer a frantic need to prove oneself, no longer the fear of being exposed as not enough. In its place emerges a slower, steadier rhythm, the rhythm of one who knows they are living from within. This does not eliminate suffering, but it changes how suffering is born. Jung offered a deeply human reflection. Meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. Collected works. Volume 11. Meaning here is not a comforting story told to oneself, but a felt sense that life with both light and shadow is oriented toward a center. When there is a center, adversity is no longer meaningless. It becomes material for growth. Returning to the self does not cause withdrawal from society. On the contrary, it allows a person to be present in the right place, no longer dissolving into the collective, nor opposing it to be different. Jung wrote, "Individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to oneself." Collected Works. Volume 8. True wholeness allows a person to participate without self-erasure. They know when a role is needed and when silence is called for. They hold boundaries without freezing. They are kind without being weak, because the center no longer lies in others' gaze, but in the self, the deeper order at work. A common misunderstanding is that returning to the self means permanent peace. Jung never promised this. He viewed the self as a coordinating principle, not a sedative. At times, the self demands difficult changes, necessary separations, or the relinquishing of outdated images. Yet, unlike the persona, the self does not coerce. It persuades through deep congruence. Jung described the relationship between the ego and the self as a learning process. The ego is only the subject of my consciousness, but the self is the subject of my total psyche. Collected Works. Volume 9. Part 2. When the ego learns to listen to this broader subject, life ceases to be a chain of reactions. It becomes a response to what seeks to live through us. Here, morality is no longer an external command. It is fidelity to an inner order. True wholeness thus carries a quality of humility. It does not need to perform. It allows fatigue and recovery, doubt and trust. It accepts finitude without despair. And above all, it liberates the life energy once trapped in performance. When consciousness and the unconscious no longer cancel each other out. A person is not good by standard. They are right by structure, not right to be praised, but right to be alive. Jung hinted at this spirit with a simple yet profound reminder. Be who you are. An idea running throughout the collected works. Returning to the self is not the end of the story, but the ground from which the story can be told truthfully. There, we no longer need the mask in order to exist. We become a living symbol of wholeness, not because we are perfect, but because we have ceased dividing ourselves. And perhaps this is the deepest freedom. Jung gestures toward the freedom to be, rather than to perform. Imagine your social mask as a suit of armor. It was once necessary. It helped you survive, helped you endure collisions, judging gazes, and the invisible arrows of the world. But if worn too long, you begin to forget the feel of real skin under sunlight, to forget the natural rhythm of your breath when you are no longer defending yourself. Tonight, as the noise of the outside world quiets, allow that armor to be set aside. Not to become weak, but to become real. Not to give up, but to listen. Let your breath slow. Let the layers of roles gently dissolve, and let the quiet call of the self guide you back to the deep center where you do not need to prove, perform, or earn acceptance through effort. There you are, not an image, not a title, not anyone's expectation. You are simply a whole human being with light and shadow coexisting within a living order. So tonight, do not sleep in order to forget the role. Sleep in order to remember who you truly are.